What's up, cool people? I'm Matt Conroy. Welcome back to our Bible study. So, this time we'll be getting into Exodus 21. In case you missed what happened previously, Israelites have left Egypt, made it across the Red Sea, been in the wilderness for a little bit, made it to Mount Sinai, and in the previous chapter, God gave them the Ten Commandments, as well as some instructions on, how to properly, for lack of a better word, make an altar to God and utilize it. And I think otherwise we're about to get into a section of God talking primarily with Moses, giving him further instructions. But anyway, I don't know if that's for sure what's going on here, or if God is speaking more so to the bulk of the people. My impression is that he's talking primarily, at least, with Moses. So anyway, here we go. Exodus 21. These are the regulations you must present to Israel. See, okay, present to Israel gives me the impression he's talking just with Moses. But anyway, if you buy a Hebrew slave, he may serve for no more than 6 years. Set him free in the 7th year, and he will owe you nothing for his freedom. If he was single when he became your slave, he shall leave single. But if he was married before he became a slave, then his wife must be freed with him. Okay, so this is talking about slaves, which really would have only happened, this wasn't just, I'm going to pay you for work. This generally, I think, would have been, somebody kind of hiring themselves out to pay off a debt. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think that's more so the case where this would be relevant, because generally speaking, I mean, they weren't supposed to just, take control of somebody unwillingly. Now you might say, they didn't want to go into debt, so doesn't that mean that they're unwilling? Let's just say that it's a little bit of a difference to just kind of deciding that, I want a bunch of people working for me, so I am going to use my influence and or the multiple more resources that I have to just take over what somebody else has and then make them work for me. But anyway, moving along. Verse 4. If his master gave him a wife while he was a slave, and they had sons or daughters, then only the man will be free in the 7th year. But his wife and children will still belong to his master. But the slave may declare, I love my master, my wife, and my children. I don't want to go free. If he does this, his master must present him before God. Then his master must take him to the door or doorpost and publicly pierce his ear with an awl. After that, the slave will serve his master for life. So, really, I guess because in this case the master is giving the slave a wife, the wife initially belonged to the master anyway, so it's not like the slave can be, set free under these circumstances with more than what they came in with, because that wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense. I mean, it would be, one might argue, kind, generous, or what have you. But, you know, this is where I guess, I don't know. It almost seems like it's giving them just a choice at the end of this time period, whether they value their freedom more or their family that they may have developed more. Also, first mention of ear piercings in the Bible, I believe. I don't know if this was the origin of any and all ear piercings, but yeah, it's not just a casual thing like today. But anyway, I'll just move along to verse 7. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she will not be freed at the end of 6 years as the men are. If she does not satisfy her owner, he must allow her to be bought back again. But he is not allowed to sell her to foreigners, since he is the one who broke the contract with her. But if the slave's owner arranges for her to marry his son, he may no longer treat her as a slave, but as a daughter. If a man who has married a slave wife takes another wife for himself, he must not neglect the rights of the first wife to food, clothing, and sexual intimacy. If he fails in any of these three obligations, she may leave as a free woman without making any payment. Okay, so I'm trying to make sure I get a proper understanding of what's going on with this. So, man sells a daughter as slave. So she's not freed after 6 years. But if she doesn't satisfy the owner, he must... Okay, so rather than the person buying the daughter of another man as a slave, rather than him selling that daughter to someone else, then if he's not satisfied, he has to allow her to be bought back again by the father. Says he's not allowed to sell her to foreigners. Doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility of selling to another Hebrew, Israelite, someone else within God's people. If the slave's owner arranges for her to marry his son, he may not... Yeah, that's just... Okay. Out of all these, that seems the easiest and fairest enough to understand, because it's like, if this, girl, woman ends up marrying your son, it's not really right to continue looking down upon her as, like, less than a family member because she's marrying into the family. So, anyway, if a man who has married a slave wife takes another... So, I guess in this case, man has woman as slaves and wants to marry slave woman. Just because she was a slave woman, that doesn't mean he can treat her, significantly worse than a non-slave wife. So that this section's really all about just, setting some standards for making sure that, nobody winds up getting some undue amount of control over another person for too long of a time, and or just to make sure that, you know, even those who would be kind of air quote lower class would still be treated with some semblance of dignity. Anyway, moving on now to the next section, verse 12. Anyone who assaults and kills another person must be put to death. But if it was simply an accident permitted by God, I will appoint a place of refuge where the slayer can run for safety. However, if someone deliberately kills another person, then the slayer must be dragged even from my altar and be put to death. So, kind of almost the eye for an eye sort of mentality, basically having the punishment fit the crime in a way. I mean, and this last verse here is, I think, just kind of, you know, with the idea that someone who killed someone else might try and come to God to, you know, give a sacrifice to attempt to atone for their wrongdoing. But if it becomes known, then you killed someone, but it also makes an allowance for accidents there, which I don't think it's too difficult to understand that, yes, people can accidentally kill other people. If it's an accident and not an intentional murder, then there's a rule where, okay, they don't have to be put to death. They can go somewhere else to escape the vengeance of the family of the deceased. Anyway, okay. I should stop just rambling on about that one point. Okay. Moving on. Verse 15. Anyone who strikes father or mother must be put to death. Harsh, but with one of the commandments being honor your father and mother, you know, I definitely don't think we follow this accurately, though, nowadays. Kidnappers must be put to death, whether they are caught in possession of their victims or have already sold them as slaves. Doesn't say anything for, you know, if they let their victims go and then the victims tell about it. So, not totally sure what happens in that case, but still, kidnapping equals death. That may sound a bit harsh, but some would probably just argue that, well, you know, you gotta make sure that you're not giving them too soft of a punishment and thus, you know, somewhat encouraging it or seeming dismissive of it. And verse 17 here, anyone who dishonors father or mother must be put to death. That, I think, is kind of the overall notion feeding into verse 15 there. Also, I just realized there was a footnote from earlier that I didn't read. So back in verse 6, when it mentions you must present him before God or before the judges who should be representing, you know, God's laws and decrees and rulings and those types of things. Anyway, the footnote here at verse 17, Greek version reads, anyone who speaks disrespectfully of. Okay. Not quite the same thing. I mean, because I guess there are things that you can do to somewhat unintentionally bring dishonor upon your family. And of course, my brain just suddenly went Mulan reference. Dishonor on you. Anyway. But, you know, I guess with the speaking disrespectfully, it's more so like an intentional dishonoring that I think is being mentioned here, rather than just yeah, you kind of did something stupid and brought dishonor to your family because of that. Anyway, verse 18. Now suppose two men quarrel, and one hits the other with a stone or fist, and the injured person does not die, but is confined to bed. If he is later able to walk outside again, even with a crutch, the assailant will not be punished, but must compensate his victim for lost wages and provide for his full recovery. So, as I'm reading this, I'm like, that sounds like the idea of, like, workman's compensation. But workman's compensation is specific to things that happen on the job. This is beyond that. So, like, somewhere between that and just general health insurance. And it also gets me, because provide for his full recovery. What if the person gets significantly maimed and can't fully recover? I don't know. Maybe we'll get an answer on that a bit later. Anyway, verse 20. If a man beats his male or female slave with a club, and the slave dies as a result, the owner must be punished. But if the slave recovers within a day or two, then the owner shall not be punished, since the slave is his property. Okay, but what's the punishment then if the slave dies? So, I realize that beating a slave might have happened, you know, in order to push them to work or work harder. But this is saying, yeah, don't push them too hard, because if you kill them, that's a bad thing. Granted, it's still kind of a bad thing if they're significantly hurt, in my mind. But again, slavery is not something we necessarily deal with a lot of, at least not in like this kind of more traditional sense of slavery. One might argue there are slavery forms today that didn't exist then, or whatever, but anyway, I digress. Verse 22. Now suppose two men are fighting, and in the process they accidentally strike a pregnant woman, so she gives birth prematurely. If no further injury results, the man who struck the woman must pay the amount of compensation the woman's husband demands, and the judges approve. But if there is further injury, the punishment must match the injury. A life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, a bruise for a bruise. See, most of us just think eye for eye and maybe tooth for tooth, but not the whole rest of this. So again, this goes back to the idea that I mentioned earlier about kind of, you know, punishment fitting the crime, so to speak. Footnote here. So she has a miscarriage. Oh, a Hebrew reads, so her children come. Yeah, basically, somebody hits the pregnant woman, pretty much forcing the child within her womb to come out. Which, that's kind of what giving birth prematurely means. Although there are premature births that, like, aren't forced. So maybe that's why they felt the need to put the footnote there. I guess having a miscarriage might also be a bit more accurate terminology relative because, well, yeah, because the assumption there is probably that the baby within the womb is then forced out and thus dies from that. Okay, anyway, moving on. Verse 26. If a man hits his male or female slave in the eye and the eye is blinded, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And if a man knocks out the tooth of his male or female slave, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. So, rather than, if it's between two free men or people, whatever, you've got the kind of eye for eye, tooth for tooth standard. But if it's directed towards a slave, then the compensation is not just, okay, they get to do the same thing to you. Compensation is they get to go free because you've just mistreated them and left them with a permanent mark, injury, whatever the case is. Now, this doesn't necessarily get into all of those previous examples in verse 24, but I wonder if that assumption is, or I wonder if the assumption is that that's also supposed to carry over to this. Anyway, all right, verse 28. If an ox gores a man or woman to death, the ox must be stoned, and its flesh may not be eaten. In such a case, however, the owner will not be held liable. But suppose the ox had a reputation for goring, and the owner had been informed but failed to keep it under control. If the ox then kills someone, it must be stoned, and the owner must also be put to death. However, the dead person's relatives may accept payment to compensate for the loss of life. The owner of the ox may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. So, now we've got something where punishment could be death or fine. Meaning money fine, not like, oh, everything's good kind of fine. So I guess, in this case, an ox goring someone to death with no prior reputation for that, it's like, it's almost similar in concept to like an accidental death. But if they had the reputation, now it becomes more than just like, oh yeah, there was this accidental death caused by your animal. This is, trying to think of the term, but basically not taking due diligence to keep something from happening that you are well aware is a possibility. Negligence, I guess, is probably the best kind of legalese term to use there. So, yeah, but again, even in the case of negligence, the person doesn't have to die in exchange. It could just, kind of pay some sort of amount or compensation to the family of the deceased. Anyway, moving on, verse 31, and I think I might just go all the way to the end and then wrap this up. The same regulation applies if the ox gores a boy or girl, since the previous one said man or woman. But if the ox gores a slave, either male or female, the animal's owner must pay the slave's owner 30 silver coins, and the ox must be stoned. Okay, so the assumption is that it gores someone else's slave, I guess? Probably. Anyway, suppose someone digs or uncovers a pit and fails to cover it. Sorry. Digs or uncovers a pit and fails to cover it, and then an ox or donkey falls into it. The owner of the pit must pay full compensation to the owner of the animal, but then he gets to keep the dead animal. Odd thing, but I'll say more on that later. If someone's ox injures a neighbor's ox, and the injured ox dies, then the two owners must sell the live ox and divide the price equally between them. They must also divide the dead animal. But if the ox had a reputation for goring, yet its owner failed to keep it under control, he must pay full compensation, a live ox for the dead one, but he may keep the dead ox. Okay, so all that stuff about an ox goring someone, it applies the same to children, at least, free children. I don't know for sure if it would be the same for children of slaves, but if it happens to a slave, there's just financial compensation instead. 30 silver coins. Hebrews says 30 shekels, which, again, was technically measured more so in weight, because it's like, oh, it's silver. Silver is just worth this amount. We figure out how much it's worth based on the weight. But we don't generally do things like that today, which is why they're using silver coins in this translation. So I guess the whole digging up or... See, uncovering... I guess the assumption of uncovering it would be, oh, I guess in either case it's like, oh, you're planning on doing something with this pit, but you need to take precautions to keep people or animals from just falling into it accidentally. So I guess, this is kind of to incentivize them to actually take those precautionary measures and to try and keep things from getting into there, because they might have a use for it, but the intended use is not going to be, oh, animal falls into it. The whole keeping the dead animal thing, I guess the reason that might be relevant is because they might think, well, now the animal's dead, so we could cook it and eat it, I guess? Or, I don't know. I guess there's something that could maybe be done with the dead animal still. But that obviously isn't as, whatever compensation is paid for the sake of the previously living animal is gonna be a bit more of a bit greater of a loss probably than the receiving of the dead animal, because otherwise why wouldn't you just make a whole bunch of pits and try and get animals to fall into those? I'm sure the idea of the compensation was to, not provide some sort of legal loophole that would, essentially almost make it worthwhile to do this thing. In terms of animals injuring animals and or killing other animals, if it seems like an accidental kind of thing or one that was not expected, then it's like, okay, y'all split the value of the living animal and the dead animal has to be split. But again, in the case of sort of negligence, then it's like, no. The person who was negligent here needs to pay a heftier price for this. Anyway, so full confession, there's going to be a number of chapters you know, following this even through the next couple of books that are, next couple of books of the Bible, I mean, that are going to be very legalistic and lay out things like this. But some of them may have some relevance to today. Some of them, whether or not you think these ones do, can actually teach us a bit about, you know, what is deemed more valuable to God, and or what, at the very least, what God wanted his people to do to set themselves apart from the other people groups around them. But anyway, okay. That does it for chapter 21. Okay, so that's going to do it for now. As always, like the video if you enjoyed it, share it with others if you want them to see. Make sure you subscribe and click the bell to get updates when I post new videos. Look down in the description for info on other social media pages. And of course, leave comments down below all that with any thoughts you have. So that's it for now. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you for the next chapter. But until then, stay cool, people.